Hello.
Hi, Sam, and hello to everyone. Welcome back to Two Peas in a Pod. This is our fourth and perhaps final episode on adolescence. We'll see. Can't promise that we won't have a fifth episode. And today we're going to talk about parent-teen communication. So we've spoken a lot about the stage of adolescence, what that's like for teens, for parents, and some practical ideas. And now we're going to get into a really central topic, I think.
Yes, and to start with a piece of Torah. Oh, would you like to introduce the Torah corner? We don't normally do that, do we?
We don't.
Just jump straight in.
Because the Torah needs no introduction. I think,
right.
It's
everywhere.
The subconscious message we're giving.
Beautiful. So what I wanted to share is the father-in-law of Moses, Jethro. He comes and visits the Jewish encampment in the desert, and Moshe informs him about everything that's happened. And then the verse says this: Baruch Hashem, blessed be the Lord, Jethro said, who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Paro, and who delivered the people from under the hand of all the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, right? Ata yadati. Now I know that Hashem is greater than anything else, right? And the Midrash steps in and says that Jethro had worshipped every idol in the known world before he came to the God of Judaism. And that's how he could say with such authority, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, because he tried every religion before he, so to speak, landed upon Judaism. And the Midrash goes on to say that 4 men said 4 things which, had they been uttered by other men, would have been scoffed at with the comment, how does he know about the ways of the Holy One, blessed be he? And it gives these examples. We've got Yitro already. The next example it gives is Moshe, who vividly describes the ways of God as just, right? He says, El Emunah, Ein Avel Bo. He describes God as being perfectly just. And the implication of the Midrash is that nobody really has the authority to describe the ways of God except for Moshe, because, as it says in Sefer Tehillim, he made his ways known unto Moshe, and Sefer Shemot describes how Moshe received an unprecedented personal revelation. So when Moshe describes God, he does so with an authority that nobody else in human history had. A second example it has is Shlomo describing something that you could only really experience had you been supremely wealthy like Shlomo was. And the final example is Nebuchadnezzar, who just basically described something that you could only really know if you had tremendous power. So I wanted to share this Midrash with you because the suggestion is only 4 times in history did somebody say something that they were uniquely well placed to say. And it seems I read the Midrash as almost a challenge to us when we communicate things to really draw from our personal experience and to make sure that the things we say are things we have the authority to say, things that really draw from our personal experience. I think a lot of the time, human beings, and I include myself in this, we parrot things we've heard from others. We've got learned responses to various stimuli, and we just we parrot things. But to speak in ways that really reflect who and what you are and what you've been through, that's a rare achievement and one that the Midrash values. So that's what I wanted to share in the Torah corner.
I think that's a really important source because, and I think that, part of sometimes the challenge is being able to reflect on, in the first place, what are my own experiences. I think I've spoken about that a couple times recently in terms of also in therapy, like trying to help a person when someone's talking about parenting to reflect on their own experiences and thoughts from when they were younger, both in order to try and understand their child better, but also to get into a mindset where, like you're saying, that they can also speak from their own experiences too.
Yes, so you can bring that experience once you've achieved that degree of self-knowledge, you can bring that self-knowledge into your conversations with others.
Speak also about the challenges, though, of in terms of the right balance, because there's potentially a risk involved in doing that too much, or doing it in certain ways. Like, for example, when I was your age, we have to do this, we have to do that.
Of course.
Potentially conflating your own experiences with your child's perhaps different experiences.
And I think another risk, so one risk is to impose your experience on others, as you say. Another risk is, and this goes back to stuff we spoke about in season 1, but knowing where the appropriate boundaries are. There can be too much disclosure. There can be too much self-disclosure.
For sure. Also an important point.
Yeah. Anyway, with those things in mind, for the rest of the session, I introduce us to
Psychology Corner.
Okay. I'm going to start. Actually, I'm not going to start with anything. I'll start with the appetizers. I've spoken, I think, almost every episode about attachment and how important it is for us in our role as parents to try and help our children achieve, or to help achieve, for us to achieve with our children secure attachment, more for them to secure with us a secure sense of attachment. And also about how in the teenage years, the form, I guess, the attachment takes is somewhat different, but that the relationship is just as important, if not more so. I usually tell parents it's more important because usually they think it's less important. So I'm trying to correct them out. So I'm not sure if it's actually more important than in younger years or not. I don't know if there's a study done to say which is more important, but it's definitely incredibly important in the teenage years. And I mentioned it because we do have this tendency to feel that together with a child's normal development in a desire for greater independence and autonomy, which we've spoken about in the past, and the more central role that their peer group plays, which we've also spoken about. And so we do have this tendency to think the thing that my child needs most is for me to take a step back, to say that, okay, I'll give you that space. I'm not going to get involved because I care about you and I think that's what you need. But doing that in a certain way or to a certain degree can also just be that you're removing the relationship from their lives. So although teens need their parents, just as much as younger children do, it often can be or should be expressed in a different way. And I think one of the ways to do that, maybe even at the most basic level for parents who are deciding to be less involved, is that teens should feel that their parents are sort of this safe port in the harbor during times of storms, right? Because they're going to be out more, although not often, right? Sometimes teens are going to be at home more than they were in younger ages. What's going on with them? Yeah. And parents need to cultivate the sense that I'm going to be there for you no matter what. When you have something that's going on with you, when there's something that's troubling you, you can come and talk to me about it. So we'll talk in terms of the practical corner about what that means or what that looks like. But that's incredibly important. I sometimes encounter parents who let's say that a teenager says, I want to meet with a psychologist. So parents will think, okay, so they want to talk to someone. Fine. Here's Aaron's number. He's a psychologist. You go meet with him. Or I'll say, maybe be a little bit kinder, right? They'll say, okay, we'll call him. We'll set up an appointment for you and then go. And I say, that's not how it works, right? Mom and dad need to come and talk and see if this is a good fit for your child, right? There's still part of your parental role. You can't just send them and forget them in terms of that, oh, they'll be okay. They're so independent, right? No, right? You need to be there as part of it. You're still an incredibly important part of their lives. So I think that's definitely an important aspect from the sense of attachment therapy and attachment theory. And part of that is also why I wanted to mention is because building up communication is a huge part of that. Whereas being able to develop that type of relationship is predicated on building a certain type of communication with your child, which we'll talk about in the practical section in terms of how to do it. But the form of communication where children can feel that they can discuss things openly with their parents. Sometimes they won't want to. Sometimes it'll feel like they they don't want to speak to their parents about certain things, to learn to be okay with that in a certain sense, but also to encourage conversation, right? To encourage openness and curiosity so that you can have that type of special relationship with your child, even as they become adolescents or going through that phase.
There's that book that's probably somewhat outdated, but I still found insightful, How to Talk So Teens Will Listen and Listen So Teens Will Talk. And the title says a lot there, that as parents, we need to develop ways of listening that are going to encourage our children to talk. I mean, I don't know how to do that. I'll leave that to you.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that in a back. I mean, it does make sense to talk about it in psychology, but I think I'll wait for the practical corner. Maybe we'll do an expanded practical corner today.
Yeah.
So that's one part. But I wanted to focus on a different theory, which is a little bit further past the attachment theory, which we discussed a little bit when in the episode on making Aliyah, intersubjective psychology. I think maybe you shared some of the philosophical underpinnings of that theory in psychology, but I'll just brief recall about how in intersubjective psychology, we view individuals not as individuals, but within the context of the interpersonal plane. I don't really exist as a detached person, a world unto myself, but that my experience is inherently connected to others, both in terms of how I experience them and they experience me. And one of the big writers in this field of psychology is Jessica Benjamin. And she writes about a number of concepts that are very important. They're important at all stages, but I think even more from a parenting perspective in the teen years. One of them is the concept of mutual recognition, which I think we spoke about in the past. It is a concept that's both relevant for parents and children, that in an intersubjective way, for me to feel like a person that matters, whose opinions matter. So it's not enough for me to just feel that, but I need to see that in the eyes of the other, right? That I am someone who matters. I'm someone who has value. While at the same time, that recognition from the other is only significant if I've recognized them as a person whose approval or judgment or sense of what's important also matters. And there's that if nobody says, "Oh, you're amazing, you're great, you did a wonderful," okay, thanks. That's nice of you to feel that way. So it is that there is a certain dialectical aspect in this already, right? In other words, I can only give recognition when I'm received that recognition, sort of in the same same way, and that connects to another concept of dialectical tension, where, well, actually, maybe just first in terms of mutual recognition, it's something that's relevant for both parents and children at this stage. In other words, that the teen very much wants their parents' approval, but it's hard for them also to give that recognition to their parents that would then make their parents' recognition meaningful for them. And also for parents, that lots of times parents of children of all ages desire that recognition from their child, but it's difficult for them to adjust to how it's given differently in adolescence. As a parent of smaller children might feel that sense of recognition when their child listens to them, right? I told you to do something, and then you go ahead and do it. So that shows me you feel about me a certain way, and that reinforces also my own concept of self as well. But you're not going to get that usually in the teen years. I mean, you can try, but good luck to you. So the recognition in teen years comes from a different place, right? And then it's one that adolescents, we spoke about in the past in terms of their own sense of identity, that sometimes will have this element where they're pushing their parents away, and DAFCA specifically not be giving their parents recognition because they think that at that developmental stage, what they feel like is that I need to have my own identity that's separate from my parents. But as they get older, they're able also to, bit by bit, give some recognition to their parents here and there, depending on how their parents can position themselves. This relates to the concept that I started talking about of dialectical tension, where you can have, what that means is that you have a relationship or an interaction where, for example, each party feels a certain way, thinks a certain way, wants to propose a certain course of action, and that creates a certain tension. And that tension doesn't need to be resolved. In other words, you
can live with that tension.
You can live with that, right? I think that eating meat in certain contexts is okay, is maybe even praiseworthy, is a positive thing, and I make a home with someone who is a devout vegetarian or vegan. They feel that eating meat is horrible,
wrong.
is wrong.
Yeah.
And for certain people, for everyone that would create tension, a certain level of tension, right? Even with as much understanding as you want. For certain people, that tension would be untenable. And they would say, well, we can't be in a relationship with someone who is so different than you. And we need to resolve it a certain way, right? So, on a practical level, right, because there's our practical ramifications, we do need to figure out, okay, what it is that we do, right? What does our home look like? What types of food do we eat together? Do we eat separately? But there can still be a certain recognition that, okay, well, I'm not going to convince her, whatever, I don't know why I gave this example. It's not vegan for Jerry. Maybe that's easier, right? That I don't need to convince her to eat meat, and she doesn't need to convince me to be a vegan. We can be different. And that can create tension within the relationship also, but we can hold that, right? There's so much more spoken about in the past about how strong the relationship can be despite the tension. And the same is true with regards to parents and adolescents as well. Learning to get to that state of dialectical tension where we can view things differently, we can believe in different things, and yet our relationship can continue without the need to resolve this tension, to get to a resolution. It's okay, right? And that difference is beneficial, right? And that connects to the mutual recognition, because the mutual recognition is saying that I'm seeing that you are not just a value, but that you're different. You're a different person, you're a different individual, and I recognize you as such without the need to, without the need to defeat you or convert you, or for me to move over to your side, right? We are different individuals, and that's okay. That's something that's important as well. Because I think that's also a really important concept that I wanted to share. And then maybe one more psychological aspect, which starting again is the practical, is that we need to, as parents, also learn, I think this starting to relate to what you raised in the Torah corner, is learning to free ourselves from our own fantasies related to our children. That we have often an unspoken expectation, dream, or fantasy that our children will be our continuation, and or that the Model 2 will be the improved version of Model 1, that they'll be able to do things that I never did, achieve what I was unable to, etc. And on the one hand, these dreams and fantasies can be beneficial because they can push us to provide more and more for our children, and or to be mindful of our parenting in a way that really can create a wonderful environment for them. But they also can be very rigid and cause us to hold them back or be very reactive in certain ways to how we relate to them. And we need to, especially at this stage, learn to free ourselves up from those fantasies and recognize that our children are going to be different people than us, and they're going to make their own choices. We can still hold on to that hope, but we need to recognize that it's a fantasy. It's not likely that it's going to happen, and also recognize how it affects how we relate to our children, so that that can give us a little bit more freedom and flexibility, learning how to respond to that, right? Because if I'm in a mindset, I don't think I mentioned, but in the past, but both of my boys at different points, just randomly walking with them, they expressed some type of expectation that at some point they're going to take over my role in the community as the community rabbi. One was like, I think one of them was like, after you die, and the other's like, after you retire, or something like that. Like he was trying to figure out, he's like, well, when you're done with this and like I'm the rabbi, are you going to like still live here? Are you going to move somewhere else? Like he got like very practical about it. So that's like their fantasy. All right. And that's a normal thing for kids too, right? Or just want to take over the family business, to be the same as my mom, as my dad, whatever it is. And parents have that as well, often. Sometimes I'm not even thinking about it, but I completely lost my train of thought because of the story.
Yeah, but I think your point
up.
is that you're allowed to have such fantasies, and you shouldn't deny their existence. But you don't want them to prejudice the actual relationship with your actual human child.
There you go. Right. So that, in other words, like when one of them starts expressing an interest in art, right? So I would say, well, a community rabbi can't also be an artist. You can't do both of those together, right? So that, I mean, whatever, that's just an extreme funny example. But as a teen, so then, for example, if that's my expectation that they're going to continue in my role, so then the teen rebelliousness that we spoke about in the past in terms of potential rebellion against religious values and norms takes on a whole different intensity, as opposed to just any religious parent that presumably also wants their child to continue along that path. But then it becomes all the more difficult because like it's not just about wanting them to, in general, continue this a certain path in life, but it's also like a much more restricted, a much more specific one. And now, oh my gosh, there's no chance that they're going to do it if this is how they're acting. Yes. That's one aspect of the fantasy. Another aspect of the fantasy is that sometimes, I think especially in our, I don't know, I was going to say especially in our generation, that we sometimes have difficulty recognizing that the role of parents is different than the role of friends, and that we might feel this temptation or desire to be our child's friend. And it's important to develop a warm and open relationship with our children, but it's important to do so as their parents and to recognize that we are not their friends and we can't be their friends. And it's important that they have friends to be their friends, and that their friends are their peers and different people from us. And that also, in other words, the reason that fantasy can hold us back is because then it makes it more difficult for us to deal with tension in the relationship or them being upset at boundaries that we've created. It makes it more difficult for us to set boundaries also, right? Because I don't want them to get upset with me. I don't want them to be mad. No, it's important still to set boundaries when necessary.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Philosophy Corner.
Well, when you're talking about communication, we come into it finally after 2 seasons into an area of philosophy that I actually do some work in, right, which is the philosophy of language. And the philosophy of language has, I think, some quite interesting insights into how communication works. So in the early 20th century, philosophy spawned a new discipline, as philosophy tends to do. The psychology departments broke away from philosophy departments originally, and sociology departments broke away from philosophy departments, etc., etc. Linguistics, as a study in university departments, kind of takes off in the 20th century because of the contribution of a number of really important philosophers. And at the first stage, this is a kind of idealized history, but it's not terribly inaccurate, but the inaccuracies help to explain what's going on, right? It's a kind of caricatured history. Pardon me. In the first stage, what developed was something called formal semantics, which tries to explain how a sentence comes to mean what it does by looking at the contribution that each word in the sentence makes to the meaning of the sentence as a whole. And you can imagine the kind of way this is done. I say the ball is red. The word "the" has a certain function. The word "ball" has a certain meaning, which you could look up in a dictionary. Is red is a predicate. And you end up with a unit of meaning, which is true if and only if some salient ball, the ball that's being discussed, is red, and false if not. Very profound. But what quickly becomes apparent is that the dictionary approved meaning of a sentence is remarkably rarely what is meant by the speaker. Either it doesn't exhaust what a speaker means, or it's just not what the speaker means at all. Let me give you a couple of examples. One, if I say to you, Aaron, you are standing on my foot, right? The word "you" picks out whoever the sentence is being addressed to. Is standing on is a predicate, and we can break that up into parts, the is and the on and the standing and whatever, and we end up with this unit of meaning which is true if and only if you are standing on my foot. But clearly what I mean when I say, Aaron, you're standing on my foot, is get off my foot, right? Which isn't what the dictionary would tell you is what I meant.
Unless you enjoy the foot smashing.
unless I'm some sort of, yeah. So yeah, it could be.
Before you get to the second example, it's just in terms of how you described it, that's actually an interesting example or application of it, because of the fact that it's very relevant when we talk also about theory of mind and people who are dealing with, for example, autism spectrum and diagnosis, that, you know, that type of sentence, is you can't take that sentence and you're setting my foot and I do not enjoy that, and I'm asking you to please get off, right? So that's making those leaps,
so
you know, the next steps is too difficult.
To use the technical terminology, there's the sentence meaning and the speaker's meaning. And what you're describing it is that the person with autistic spectrum disorder might find it much easier to access the sentence meaning, right? What the sentence uttered literally means, than to discover the speaker's meaning, which is what the speaker intended to communicate using that sentence. Another example is one waiter says to the other, "The cheese sandwich got up and left without paying." And that sentence, right, if you put that through some sort of translation manual, it's gonna, the sentence meaning is something that's true if and only if the cheese sandwich itself actually somehow got up and walked out of the shop, which is not just false but impossible. However, the second waiter is going to know exactly what the first waiter meant, which is,
or if it is, you should not. If it is possible, you should not eat at that restaurant anymore. Yeah. Go somewhere else.
Right. That's not a cheese sandwich you should want to eat. No. The second waiter is going to understand that what the first waiter meant was the person who had ordered the cheese sandwich and eaten the cheese sandwich got up and left without paying. It's a figure of speech called a metonym, but it's not to be taken literally. And again, we're quite good at figuring out what people, especially the neurotypical, we're quite good at working out what speakers actually mean using the sentences that they use, even though the sentences they use don't mean what the speaker actually means, what the speaker literally means. So what grew up to augment the study of formal semantics, because like I said, formal semantics just gives you the meanings of sentences. It tries to work out the meanings of sentences by tracking the contribution of the smaller parts of a sentence. What grew up to augment semantics is a field of study known as pragmatics. And pragmatics is about trying to figure out what the speaker means. And one of the kind of founding fathers of pragmatic theory is a philosopher called Paul Grice, who comes up with something known as the cooperative principle. And the cooperative principle, basically, he says a conversation is a cooperative endeavor. Both parties, the technical phrase is interlocutors, the parties of a conversation. The interlocutors, they want to, in a sense, help each other along. They're both trying to communicate what they take to be the truth of the matter to the other. And like I said, this is a cooperative endeavor. Sometimes you might be more or less cooperative. You can be coy because there may be things that you don't want to communicate to another person, right? How does the principle of the cooperative principle work? So he says like this: if you want to have a successful conversation, he says, this is a direct quote, you need to make your contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. In order to make this simpler, what that really means, philosophers, including Grice, broke this down into a number of sub-principles. One is be informative, which means make your contribution as formative as is required. So if you're assisting me in mending my car, let's say, right, I expect your contribution to be neither more nor less than what's required. That's part of what, so if, for example, a particular stage, I need 4 screws, I expect you to hand me 4 rather than 2 or 6. So if I say to you, Aaron, let's say you meet me out in the middle of Kiryat HaSharon and I'm desperately looking for a house. And I say, do you know where so-and-so lives? And you say, yes, I do. Bye. Well, that clearly wasn't sufficiently informative given what you knew I was trying to get out of you. But if you gave me the address where he lives and the street and the number and the color of his door and a brick by brick description of the building in which is it, okay, that's enough. That's too much, right? So you need to provide is called the maxim of quantity, the right amount of information. The second is you always have to believe what you assert, and you even have to be willing to defend your knowledge of an assertion. So if I say, hey, Aaron, do you happen to know how much a bottle of milk costs? And you say, yeah, it's, I don't know, 5 shekels 60 or something. And I say, how do you know that? And you say, I don't have a clue. I've never bought milk in my life, right? That again, so it wouldn't be that you weren't being truthful necessarily, but it's called the maxim of quality. You weren't providing information that you knew to be quality information justified by the evidence. There's the maxim of relation, which says you should always make your contributions as relevant as possible. And there's the maxim of clarity. You should be as clear as possible. And where the real brilliance here comes is that once you recognize that all of those maxims, those are basically the cardinal rules of conversation. Thing is, we break them all the time, but we break them in clever ways, right? So, for example, I say to you, Aaron, are you ready to record this episode on communication with adolescents? And you say, 1,000,000%, Sam. Well, you've just violated the maxim of quality. I'll tell you why. Because you've said something which can't possibly be true. Because there's only ever 100% in any given measurement. You can't have more than 100. So what you've said is literally false. But the thing is, I know that you are cooperating, and you know that I know that you're cooperating, right? There's this kind of mutual knowledge. This is something Robert Stallnick's the common ground. The common ground of the conversation is the things we're all assuming for the sake of the conversation, and we all know that the others know for the sake of the conversation. So I know that it can't possibly be 1,000,000%, and that you're not trying to lie to me, and you know that I know that. And because you know that I know that, you can rest assured that I'm going to figure out that this is a hyperbole, right? And likewise, a very similar thing was going on with the cheese sandwich leaving the room, right? I know that you're not, hold on, like, we're not playing some silly game here where we're like pretending that things can move and whatever. You were trying to make an actual contribution to a conversation. But what you said can't possibly, either you're insane, right? Or you meant something different. And the way I'm able to figure out that you meant something different was because I actually know which of the laws, so to speak, of a conversation you're breaking. And by breaking that law, you're exploiting my knowledge of how conversations work to kind of push me in the direction of your speaker's meaning. And very often sometimes you don't want to cooperate, and you can make that clear as well. I could say something like, I ask you a question. I could say something like, Aaron, do you know where Bob is? But the thing is, it's a secret where Bob is. So you say something like, yes, I do. Anyway, how are you, Sam? And you've very clearly not provided me with enough information. Well, that might be a way of your communicating to me that even though you do know, you're not at liberty to tell me. Because if you were at liberty to tell me, you should tell me, given the principles of cooperation of the conversation. So in a nutshell, what philosophers try to do when they want to understand communication and how it works, they want to understand the nuts and bolts of language, which is called syntax and semantics. Syntax is grammar. How do you put words together in an order that actually allows them to stick together to make a sentence? That's syntax. Then more of the nuts and bolts of meaning is semantics. What contribution does each word make to the meaning of the whole sentence? But the real kind of the most juicy part of the philosophy of communication is figuring out what speakers actually mean, given what the sentences they use mean. And a great deal of the time, what the speaker means is not what the sentence they use means taken literally. We very often want to be taken metaphorically or want to be taken figuratively. And the way that we figure this out is because there's a kind of unspoken mutual agreement that in this conversation, we're going to play by certain rules. We're going to make our contributions relevant, make our contributions have a certain quality, make our contributions true, etc., etc. And I think very often with adolescents, they don't want to cooperate, right? And you see this by them making their contributions to conversations as short as can possibly be, right? They'll give yes/no answers. In some teenagers will give yes/no answers rather than elaborate upon things. That's because they're not really conversing with you. Because they're not really playing by the rules that Grice describes. Conversation is a collaborative, cooperative endeavor. And I think, that title of that book that I mentioned, How to Speak So Teens Will Listen, how to listen so that teens will speak. The challenge here is to create an atmosphere in which cooperation is the norm, in which people want to share, because it's only in such an atmosphere that communication can really blossom. Very often we want to say much more than what the dictionary meaning of our words could communicate. And if you want to say much more, you're only going to succeed in conveying that information in a collaborative environment. So in a nutshell, that's the philosophy of communication.
I think that's really interesting, because I think maybe related when we talk about the word communication, right? So related to some of the points that you mentioned, we could mean very different things, right? We say that the topic of this episode is parent-paid communication. Are we actually talking about the communication? Or I feel like maybe what I'm thinking about more is more the communication as an expression of the form of relationship.
Right.
Which I think when you're talking about the concept of cooperation, so then that's very much
that's what
aligned.
Grice is saying.
The same thing.
What Grice is saying is that literal communication only really works against the background of relationship. And Stalnaker, with this notion of common ground, like, we can take shortcuts in conversations. So we're talking about, if we're having a conversation in which my sister is the only other person that's been mentioned, and I say, oh, actually, I need to go and pick her up right now from the airport, you'll know who I mean, because she is in what's called the common ground of the conversation. But a common ground can hold from conversation to conversation. So what will often happen is, if I want to communicate something to my son, but I don't want anyone else to understand what I'm saying, I can use code words that draw from our personal, private experience. That, so what is common ground between me and my son is not necessarily common ground between everybody in the room. And I can exploit that. There's a great game called Articulate, where you have to get people to guess the word that's on your card. And in one of the rounds, right, normally you just need to get your teammate to guess the word you're speaking. But in one of the rounds, anyone can guess. And the way to try and win is to give clues that only your teammate could possibly understand, because otherwise someone else will jump in and guess what the word is. And what that game shows is that there's not one common ground to a conversation, because what's common to me and my wife isn't necessarily common to everybody else in the room. And again, sometimes that can be exploited to communicate only to some people but not to others. What this shows, I think, is that what I mean by communication, in this very literal sense of taking a parcel of information and moving it from one brain to another, and what you mean by communication in the realm of psychology, which has a lot to do with having a certain sort of relationship, they're two sides of the same coin.
I think maybe in some ways that's true, but I think that when you talk about the concept of a common ground, so I think that the goal of developing communication between people, between parents and teens, between spouses, is much more than just trying to create, for example, as wide and expansive of common ground as possible, but that really the goal is about strengthening the relationship and the connection. The common ground is an expression of that, perhaps.
But that's right. I agree that the common ground is an expression of that and not the main point. But some of Grice's principles, like A conversation that's flourishing, according to Grice, is one where each interlocutor wants to express what they take to be the truth to the other. Well, we don't always want that. Sometimes we want to hold things back. Sometimes we want to be secretive. Sometimes we want to. So I think that a really healthy relationship between parent and child is one in which communication is going to be more rather than less cooperative, because people are going to want to share within the bounds of appropriateness. They're going to want to share what it is they take themselves to know. Sometimes it's too much. Like one of my children wants to share every headline he's heard with us, right? It's almost like he can't bear holding in a piece of bad news without sharing it with someone. And sometimes I don't want to hear right now how many people are dying of malnutrition in a certain country. It's just a bit much. But I suppose that in a sense, that's that child just wanting to share, not wanting to know things, or even to be disturbed by things that aren't shared with those he cares about and loves. Anyway,
thank you for sharing.
We'll
Maybe relate to that example on the practical thing.
I'd like to. So,
The practical corner.
Okay, so I have a lower number of lower. I always forget. You're the philosopher of language.
Smaller number.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Of practical points, but also we'll go into them in a little bit more depth. So the first one is, in terms of parents communicating with teens, is recognizing that adolescents are going to be a lot more sensitive to judgment. Spoke about in the previous episodes on this. And therefore, when trying to engage in conversation and communication, in order to strengthen the relationship, to keep that in mind. So one way to do that is by not asking questions that could potentially be viewed as judging. In other words, why did you do that? Right. What were you thinking? Right. I mean, what were you thinking is never actually a question at all. Right. It's like, you must not have been thinking is the meaning of that phrase. What were you thinking?
Speaker's meaning.
But to try and approach things. Yeah. But to try and approach things from a more curious and inquisitive standpoint. So to say, could you tell me a little bit about what was going on in your mind? Could you tell me what were you thinking? Like how did you view this proceeding? Or for example, let's say with the example you just mentioned about the malnutrition, say, like, oh, wow, what do you think about that? Like it seems like that this is the kind of headline that really catches your eyes. Like, do you have any ideas? It's like, why?
Why? Yeah.
Why are you sharing this as opposed to the Maccabi Netanya scores? Like, what about this is different for you? And I think that being able to do that, what you're doing is a phrase I would use is that you're becoming interested in their subjectivity, right? So expressing interest in them as a different, unique individual from you and from others, right? What sorts of things interest them, how they view the world, what motivates them, what gets them going, what causes them to be more reticent, and also seeing things more and more related to their unique strengths and abilities as well. And I think that's also an important part of that too, having those types of conversations.
I'm going to take that on, Aaron. I think I don't do that enough to my kids. Like, I'll ask them all sorts of questions and hear about their day and whatever. But to stop back and say, what makes that interesting to you? Like, why? That's fascinating. But of all the things you could share, what is it about this that makes you want to tell me? I think that would be an interesting line of conversation. I'm going to try it.
All right. Guacamole, taking that on yourself. I'm going to try it too.
Okay, good.
So the next one actually happened to me recently. It relates to the first point, is in terms of learning to hold the dialectic tension. In other words, that having communication and conversation with the realization that I don't necessarily need to resolve this tension, resolve the conflict, resolve the differences between us, or that it could potentially be a resolution. There could be a practical resolution, but it's not the one that I wanted, right? And yet still that it won't end the relationship between. So we resolve the practical question, but we won't resolve the inherent tension of how could I think this and you think the other way, and still will be in a relationship. So to learn to hold that, to hold on to that. I had something like this recently where our oldest, so we're recording this a little bit after Yom Zikaron, you didn't release it after the school. So she's in 7th grade, and the school was taking the kids the girls to a ceremony that was taking place either inside or right outside a military cemetery. And her instant reaction when she heard this was, I am not going to that whatsoever. And my initial reaction was, in my head, I just was able to not say it out loud, is, what do you mean? Of course you're going to that. Why would you think that you're not going to go to this event that's all about connecting to the Jewish people, to the Jewish state, to expressing identification with them, to being a part of the group, to be a part of the club, be a part of Ham Yisrael? How could you not go to that? So thankfully I held back. It might be that I heard about it from Shira instead of from her, so I was able to have that space. And then we had a car ride where I was able to ask her about it, to try and understand things a little bit better from her perspective of what was it, like getting into the first point, like what, tell me a little bit more about it. Like what about it like makes it so almost instinctive to you that I'm not, definitely not going? What about it? Are there parts of it that you think you miss out by not going? Just try to expand the conversation a little bit to understand a little bit more things from her perspective. And then at the end to say, honestly, the way that it helped me understand a little bit more. And then it reflected on my own thoughts and thinking, you know what? It is a little bit young for a 7th grader to be going to a ceremony in a military cemetery. Yeah. And maybe that's better. Maybe it's better for her not to go. So that helped me. But also not feeling the need to say at the end of the conversation is, okay, well, fine. I heard you. I gave you a space to feel heard, but I want you to do it because of ABC. But to say, I think we just spoke about it. Like, let's keep thinking about it, or to give her the ability to make that decision, or to revisit it, not to close it right away.
No.
And I think that's important, not just in terms of the relationship, but there's another thing I guess I've been noticing a lot recently in terms of just the specific clients that I'm working with now. You can call it a lot of different things. One terminology that popped in my head is from the field of mentalization-based therapy, which talks about what's called thought-action fusion, where a person feels, at an emotional sense, that having thought something is equivalent to having acted upon it. So if I think that something if I recognize there's a violent urge that I have towards someone else, that's the same thing as if I've already done it. I notice this a lot. You can call it different things, but I notice this a lot with clients where it's sometimes hard to even think about disagreeing with their spouse, or criticizing something that their parent did in childhood, or adopting a difficult course of action vis-a-vis a child might need
because it feels to them like acting.
Support. Yeah, I can't even entertain the possibility. And so much of the work with them is to help them realize we can talk about it. We can imagine it. We can think about it. And that's different. That creates that space. And then maybe, there are clients who are like, well, if I talked about it in therapy with Aaron, his expectation is that by next week I'll have done it. In other words, it's just practicing in order to do it. I say, no, we can just talk about it. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. And that ability to do that increases flexibility. It really can help people. And I think that relates also to this idea of the dialectical tension, that is okay to talk about things. You don't need to get this resolution. You can recognize the fact that there's this difficulty, there's this tension, there's this difference between us. That's okay. There's a third part. I don't know if you had something you wanted to say about those.
I agree. They seem very wise, practical points.
Okay, fine. The last one is in terms of learning to circle back, that you don't need to always discuss everything in the moment during the point of tension, of anger, or sadness, frustration, whatever. But you can also talk about it afterwards as well. It's usually because of the fact that this stage also, there's, like we've spoken in the past, emotions are much more intense. And the ability to control them can be more challenged. So it's just a wise course of action to wait until things are a little bit calmer. But also, and I think that relates to that point of holding on to the tension, right? In other words, that if there's a problem, you don't need to resolve it right away. You don't need to resolve it all, but maybe we can also wait a little bit until we work it through. It also, I think, does
So
leave
here
this message of curiosity. Oh, sorry.
I see the wisdom of the third suggestion too, but I have a worry about how to apply it in real time. So I remember recently had a very emotional disagreement with a teenage child, and it was clear to me that there was going to be no mutually satisfactory conclusion to this discussion. It was late at night, and the teenager was really emotional. And my parental aim at that moment was to get to a point where we could say, look, we're not going to be able to agree about this evening. I love you very much. Our relationship, so to speak, I wouldn't use this language, but the relationship can stand this dialectical tension, as to use the language that we've been developing. Let's talk about this in the morning when you're less tired, I'm less tired, and emotions maybe are less high. Problem is,
Yeah, we spoke about that in the negative emotions episode. You probably got it from there.
I probably did, but the problem. So that was my aim. Problem is,
yeah,
that the worst thing you can tell somebody who's panicking is to calm down, right? What do you mean calm down? I'm perfectly calm. That's the worst thing to do. Likewise, analogously, my concern was that I would sound callous, would sound like there's something that this child desperately wants to communicate to me now, and that's part of why they're emotionally highly strung about it. I know that it's not going to conclude in a way that's satisfactory to the child until maybe never, and that's okay. We're going to be able to live. We're going to have to learn to live with this discord. But my question is how to apply this practical wisdom about circling back, to use the language you use, without sounding. It can sometimes feel a bit abrupt or uncaring, or how can they not want to carry on talking about this? This is like existentially important to me.
Yeah. I mean, I hear your point, and I think that it's not always easy to know the right way to resolve it, to get that balance, because you do want your child to feel like you care about them, and that when they're in distress, that they can come to you. And there is also a certain value in creating that boundary as well, and also realizing that you're not always going to be the one that will calm them down, that they also need to help themselves develop their own self-soothing tendencies and abilities. But definitely try not to come across in a callous way.
Gosh forbid. Yeah.
I mean, it's hard, right? It's midnight, right?
Yeah.
1 a.m, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I'm so tired. I can't.
And this conversation has gone round and round, and it isn't easy. But I do see that.
But it can help to reframe. Yeah, so to help them try and reframe, like zoom out for a second, to give them like a few minutes of that, even just distracting them a little bit, talking about something else, and to help them move on a little bit so that you're not leaving them in that extreme state of distress. They look, this is hard. I feel like we're going around in circles, and I see how difficult this is for you. I feel horrible leaving you in this and not resolving it. It's really hard for me to do that. I've also honestly had situations, right, in terms of modeling, where there's been things that have kept me up late at night in terms of my own issues, or me and your mom. Like sometimes we learn that but it makes such a difference being able to revisit it after you've slept a little bit, because
in the morning
it's not helping. But it's hard, right? Because it triggers all these things, feeling like we're not there for our kid when they need us.
It's the worst. It's the worst. But I think I like that reframing, Aaron. And I think also in that reframing, you can circle back to some of the things that you do agree about.
Yeah.
We've got these things that matter more, that we share, and we'll come back to these more difficult issues another time, perhaps when we're both feeling more up to it. Learning how to do that is hard, and it's hard because these things often jump up at you when you're not expecting them.
If you create that psychological space for yourself so that you can identify them and be present with your kids in that moment. And I think
maybe you can listen to a great podcast
about being present. But we related to the circling back, I think there are all sorts of different conversations. And when we're talking about a conversation or an issue that came up that created tension between parent and child, a disagreement, a fight, yelling, whatever it is, being able to circle back when both you and your child are calmer also is an incredibly important form of modeling, where you're also showing them that things can be fixed, right? We can talk about things again after we both maybe create a little bit of space and hope to get to a better resolution. Taking responsibility for your own actions, talking about your own feelings and maybe what was difficult for you in a conversation also can be really, really helpful. And it's, you're just as parents are people too, right? So sometimes we're able to do that a lot better a little bit later on when we ourselves just calm down too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there we go. I feel we really communicated today.
I feel so too. I think so too. On all levels of intent and meaning.
Yeah. And lots of warm wishes to all of our listeners, and keep spreading the word about 2 Peas in the Pod.
Indeed. See you all next week.
Take care. Bye.